So you've worked out some of the bad things that might happen to your organization's valuable assets. You've probably got a really long and quite possibly overwhelming list of risks, things that might happen to those assets. You're sweating just thinking about all the work that's involved in mitigating those. And I would be too. However, there's a very simple, very efficient way of doing a first pass across all of those risks so you can understand which ones you need to work on and which ones you need to work on the soonest. It's a pretty crucial step, and if you miss it, you may end up taking on too much work and having too many projects on the go at once, and this will lead to insomnia, sleepless nights, and worrying about your information security. So today we're going to be looking at risk mitigation strategies. If you've been following our series, you've already learned about how to discover your assets, how to discover your risks, and how to assess those risks. And now it's time to look at what do we do about those risks. In the description below, you'll find some tools and some free downloads, some PDFs and some training that might be helpful for this. There's a specific guide around risk that takes the whole process into account. So if you can't wait for the next video, you can always check that out, use it as a reference, whatever. My name is Mike Pierce, and this is my series on information security. Every week I'll be bringing you some simple ideas and some not so simple but equally as important ideas on how to protect your business and make it much more difficult for cyber criminals to use your valuable assets for their own nefarious ends. If you've got this far through the series, you'll understand why information security is important in keeping your valuable assets safe so you can get on with the job of achieving your business goals. If you like this video or any of the others, hit the like button, subscribe so you're notified when a new one drops, and we can get the word out there and hopefully we can make the internet a slightly safer place. Before we talk about the strategies themselves, I want to talk about where understanding risk mitigation strategies fits into the overall process. So we've done asset identification, risk discovery, and last week we did risk assessment, and now we're on to risk mitigation strategy development. After this step and in future videos, we're going to be talking about control implementation and then monitoring and review of your controls and your risk management framework. So mitigation strategies are typically developed after you've done your risk discovery and your risk assessment. You've got this pile of risks, and now you need to understand what you're going to do about them, and that's where the mitigation strategies comes in. Starting with your highest priority risks, we're going to be looking at which mitigation strategies or even combination of strategies is best employed to solve the problem of that risk. Now let's take a look at the strategies themselves, see what all the fuss is about, and how we might implement those. Risk avoidance is about avoiding a risk entirely by eliminating the thing that would cause the risk in the first place. While it's not always possible, it's often the safest option. If you've got a thing that presents risk, then don't do that thing, and then your risk goes away. Some examples of this would be if storing customers or clients' credit card data in your own system, you find that too risky, then you can avoid that risk by getting a third-party payment processor such as Stripe to process the payments. You want to launch a product in a new country or a new market, but you decide that that country has far too stringent regulatory requirements that you just don't or can't meet. Therefore, you wouldn't launch in that market. Maybe one of your new products, you want to use a new piece of technology that's known to have some significant vulnerabilities, and you decide, actually, that's just not worth the risk. We won't do that. Remember, avoidance isn't always the best strategy. Sometimes the potential benefits will outweigh the risks, and that's just business. There's risk and there's reward, and you have to sometimes take risks to reap the rewards. Risk reduction, commonly known as risk mitigation, is another strategy. And this is probably where you'll spend most of your time when thinking about how to solve risks. It involves taking actions to decrease either the likelihood of the risk happening or the impact of the risk should it happen. Examples are to reduce the likelihood of unauthorized access to your system. You might implement stronger password policies, such as more complex passwords or longer passwords, or even 2FA. Or you might conduct regular security campaigns for your employees around phishing or tailgating or that kind of stuff. All of these things will reduce the likelihood of there being unauthorized access. To reduce the impact of unauthorized access, you might use encryption for your data that's at rest and in transit, meaning that if it does get breached, it's pretty much useless. Or you might adopt data minimization practices. So you're storing data unencrypted, but it's completely benign data that if it did leak, nobody's going to mind, it doesn't matter. Another example is reducing the impact of data loss by keeping multiple frequent and regular backups, or using redundant systems like hot swappable databases or offsite storage. A final example of reducing the likelihood of software vulnerabilities would be to implement a regular patching schedule that's aligned with a patching policy. You may also conduct regular vulnerability scans and tests to ensure that the software you do have doesn't have any vulnerabilities and you're up to date with your patching. Risk reduction often involves a multi-layered approach in which you might choose to implement different controls for different aspects of the risk. You might choose to implement controls to reduce the likelihood of risk happening and a different control to implement the impact of a risk happening. Risk transfer involves shifting some or all of the risk to a third party. Typically this would be insurance cover or in your contracts. Some examples here would be cyber insurance to cover the cost of breach or the PR around the breach or the loss of data or hardware and that kind of stuff. You might outsource some of your operations to certain vendors. So if you don't want to have on-prem hosting because it seems too risky, then you might use a cloud service provider such as AWS or Azure. And that means that they take on a bunch of the risks around the security. You might hire a managed security service provider to handle your network and your monitoring and the understanding of all your traffic. You may also include indemnification clauses in your contracts. This will transfer the risk of something bad happening to the supplier or the partner, making them unable to hold your organization liable. Remember though, that in most of these instances, you can transfer the financial impact, but the reputational impact, that's still yours. Your business may still experience negative consequences, even if you have cover for financial losses. Sometimes, after analysis, you may decide that you just want to accept this risk. This doesn't mean ignoring it. This means weighing up the benefits and the consequences of the risk and then deciding to proceed anyway. Some examples of this are, if we use one of the previous examples about using new technology that may have a vulnerability in it, you think that actually using this technology might give you a competitive advantage, so it's worth the risk to be first to market. You might decide to store unencrypted data in systems to improve performance. You may even allow remote work. Even though you know it increases your risk, it makes your staff happier, it lowers attrition, and it's much, much easier to hire. However, when accepting risks, make sure you document the decision-making process and the rationale that went behind your final decision. This is so important. You don't want to be in a situation where a senior leader comes at you shaking their fist, shouting, why did you make that decision, and not be able to back it up with how you made the decision in the first place and who was involved. You should establish thresholds for these risks. So if the threshold goes up, then you might want to look at the risk again and potentially mitigate it in a different way. But you should continue monitoring the risk and be prepared to implement other strategies if circumstances around this risk change. Finally, there's risk sharing, and this involves partnering with another party so you both share a portion of the risk. You could enter into a joint venture for a new product launch, which means that both your parties are sharing the risk of that product not working. You could form a consortium with other companies in your industry to share ideas, understanding, and information around security. You could collaborate with a research institute on coming up with new ideas, which means you're sharing both the IP and also the associated risks. Risk sharing can be particularly good for smaller companies that might not have the resources to tackle risks by themselves. Now, you might be wondering, do we think about the strategy first and then the specific mitigation, or do we do the two things together? The answer is, it can happen both ways. But there are benefits to approaching them separately, even if it's one directly after the other. So step one is doing the strategy selection first. You might want to go through all of your risks and broadly say, accept this one, reduce this one, avoid this one, accept this one, mitigate this one, etc., etc. This gives you a really broad overview of all of your risks and what you might want to do about them. The decision on which strategy to take is going to be influenced by the nature of the risk, your organization's appetite to risk, the available resources for dealing with that risk, the business objectives that you've got that may or may not be impacted by that risk, and importantly, regulatory requirements. Some risks you just might have to do because there's a regulatory reason to do them. Step two is mitigation planning. So once you've come up with your strategy, or a combination of strategies for a risk, you would then think about the specific actions or controls you'd implement to look after that risk. For example, if you chose a risk reduction strategy for unauthorized access, your implementation might involve multi-factor authentication, enhancing authorization, or even some staff training. If you decide on risk transfer for any potential cyber attacks, then you might want to plan about how you're going to get some cyber insurance and where you're going to get it from. The real benefit of the two-step approach, so doing the mitigation strategy first and then the implementation of that strategy, is it allows you to think broadly about your options before you dive too deep into how you might solve them. It can help you prevent jumping to a specific control or a specific mitigation before you've fully considered all of the strategic options. That said, in reality, these steps quite often blend together, and it's okay if you do them at the same time. As you're thinking about your strategies, you're going to be thinking about what mitigations you might implement for this risk. And if you're thinking about your mitigations, you're automatically going to be thinking about what category that mitigation strategy slots into. The specific mitigations available to you, given available resources or budget, may influence the strategy that you choose to take. The key is to ensure that whatever mitigations you choose, they align with the overall strategy that you've chosen for that risk. This approach helps to ensure you have a really cohesive, really well held together, robust risk management framework. So, how do you put these strategies into effect? Step 1, prioritize your risks. Focus on mitigating your highest impact, most likely to occur risks first. Use your risk assessment results to guide this prioritization. Step 2, use a combination of strategies. Often different strategies applied to the same risk is the way you want to go. For example, you might want to reduce the risk of a cyber breach through better security controls. You might want to transfer some of the risk of a cyber breach through insurance, and you may end up accepting a small residual risk. Step 3, document your mitigation plans. Keep clear records of what you're doing and why you're doing it. This documentation is crucial for audits, regulatory compliance, and ensuring continuity if key staff change. Step 4, review and update regularly. As your business evolves, so will your risk and mitigation strategies. Set a schedule for regular reviews of your risk management process, your risk log, and the strategies that you've employed. Step 5, involve a team. Risk mitigation is everyone's responsibility. Ensure your team understand the risks and their role in the mitigation. This might involve regular training sessions or including their risk responsibilities in their job descriptions or their performance evaluation. Remember, the goal of risk mitigation isn't to eliminate all risks. That is impossible. Instead, it's about managing your risks to an acceptable level to allow your business to thrive and achieve its goals. By applying these strategies thoughtfully and systematically, you can significantly improve your organization's resilience to potential threats. And risk mitigation isn't a one-time activity, it's part of a cyclical process. As you implement mitigation strategies and controls, you need to reassess the risks, potentially discovering new ones or reassessing previous risks that are now more or less risky given the changes in your organization through the controls you've implemented. This cyclical nature of risk management is why it's really important to regularly review your process, review your strategies, review your framework to make sure it's still doing what it should be doing and it's still helping you mitigate your risks and make sure that your process is aligned with your business objectives. In the next video, we're going to look at some specific controls you can implement to mitigate some of the more common information security risks. If you want to know when this video is published, hit subscribe. If you found this video at all useful, please hit the like button. It really helps me get the word out there, and hopefully together we can make the internet a much safer place. Thanks for watching. See you next time.